Hi guys, I am so behind on the books that I've been reading and the discussions I've wanted to share, but this book, Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand, it's called Unbroken, a World War II story of survival, resilience, and redemption, is too good not to share. I just have to share my review of this book. It's so good. If you're not familiar with the story of Louis Zamperini, I highly recommend looking into him and studying about his life because he's on my list of people I'm excited to meet in heaven. I am very proud of him. I just want to read a couple of excerpts from this. There is so much detail in this book, and I don't want to spoil a lot of it. So there are just parts that I'm going to pick out that I really appreciated that I'd like to share with you. Louis started out as kind of a hoodlum when he was a child. He was very much into mischief, but a lot of the characteristics that he developed as a child helped him as an adult. And this is a little description to give you an idea of what he was like as a kid. This is on page 7. It says, in a childhood of artful dodging, Louis made more than just mischief. He shaped who he would be in manhood, confident that he was clever, resourceful, and bold enough to escape any predicament. He was almost incapable of discouragement. When history carried him into war, this resilient optimism would define him. He went from house to house, stealing treats that were in the window, pies that were cooling, going into people's houses, stealing food. He was just full of mischief, but he was also incredibly tricky. And with those skills, he was able to develop some really neat characteristics that he needed as an adult when he was in World War II. On page 10, so they're Italian. Their family is Italian. Both his father and mother were born in Italy. And his mother, Louise, was very short. She was a very petite woman. Louis's mother, Louise, took a different tack. Louis was a copy of herself, right down to the vivid blue eyes. When pushed, she shoved. Sold a bad cut of meat, she'd march down to the butcher, frying pan in hand. Loving mischief, she spread icing over a cardboard box and presented it as a birthday cake to a neighbor who promptly got the knife stuck. When Pete told her he'd drink his castor oil if she gave him a box of candy, she agreed, watched him drink it, then handed him an empty candy box. You only asked for the box, honey, she said with a smile, and that's all I got. She understood Louis's restiveness. One Halloween, she dressed as a boy and raced around town trick-or-treating with Louis and Pete. A gang of friends, thinking she was one of the local toughs, tackled her and tried to steal her pants. Little Louise Zamperini, mother of 4, was deep in the melee when the cops picked her up for brawling. Knowing that punishing Louis would only provoke his defiance, Louise took a surreptitious route toward reforming him. In search of an informant, she worked over Louis' schoolmates with homemade pie and turned up a soft boy named Hugh, whose sweet tooth was Louis' undoing. Louise suddenly knew everything Louis was up to, and her children wondered if she had developed psychic powers. Sure that Sylvia was snitching, Sylvia is his little sister, Louis refused to sit at the supper table with her, eating his meals in spiteful solitude off the open oven door. He once became so enraged with her that he chased her around the block, outrunning Louis for the only time in her life. Sylvia cut down the alley and dove into her father's workshed. Louis fleshed her out by feeding his 3-foot-long pet snake into the crawl space. She then locked herself in the family car and didn't come out for an entire afternoon. It was a matter of life and death, she said some 75 years later. For all her efforts, Louise couldn't change Louis. He ran away and wandered around San Diego for days, sleeping under a highway overpass. He tried to ride a steer in a pasture, got tossed onto the ragged edge of a fallen tree, and limped home with his gashed knee bound in a handkerchief. 27 stitches didn't tame him. He hit one kid so hard that he broke his nose. He upended another boy and stuffed paper towels in his mouth. Parents forbade their kids from going near him. A farmer, furious over Louis's robberies, loaded his shotgun with rock salt and blasted him in the tail. Louis beat one kid so badly, leaving him unconscious in a ditch, that he was afraid he'd killed him. When Louise saw the blood on Louis's fist, she burst into tears. So this gives you an idea of his background, and what was able to save him at this age was his big brother Pete encouraged him to run, and he found out that he was actually really good at it. On page 13, It says the rehabilitation of Louis Zamperini began in 1931 with a key. 14-year-old Louis was in a locksmith shop when he heard someone say that if you put any key in any lock, it has a 1 in 50 chance of fitting. My son Connor thought that was pretty cool. He's like, no way is that possible. And I said, it's true, 1 in 50. Inspired, Louis began collecting keys and trying locks. He had no luck until he tried his house key on the back door of the Torrance High gym. When basketball season began, there was an inexplicable discrepancy between the number of 10-cent tickets sold and the considerably large number of kids in the bleachers. In late 1931, someone caught on, and Louis was hauled to the principal's office for the umpteenth time. In California, winter-born students entered new grades in January, so Louis was about to start ninth grade. The principal punished him by making him ineligible for athletic and social activities. Louis, who never joined anything, was indifferent. When Pete learned what had happened, he headed straight to the principal's office. Though his mother didn't yet speak much English, he towed her along to give his presentation weight. He told the principal that Louis craved attention, but had never won it in the form of praise, so he sought it in the form of punishment. If Louis were recognized for doing something right, Pete argued, he'd turn his life around. He asked the principal to allow Louis to join a sport. When the principal balked, Pete asked him if he could live with allowing Louis to fail. It was a cheeky thing for a 16-year-old to say to a principal, but Pete was the one kid in Torrance who could get away with such a remark and make it persuasive. Louis was made eligible for athletics for 1932. And then the story continues. Pete was actually his coach. He helped train, he helped Louis run and practice, and that's literally what saved him as a teenager, his big brother helping him. Running was something that gave Louis peace. His body just felt like it had to run. This is on page 15. In the summer of 1932, Louis did almost nothing but run. On the invitation of a friend, he went to stay at a cabin on the Chahuia Indian Reservation in Southern California's high desert. Each morning he rose with the sun, picked up his rifle, and jogged into the sagebrush. He ran up and down hills, over the desert, through gullies. He chased bands of horses, darting into the swirling herds, and trying in vain to snatch a fistful of mane and swing aboard. He swam in a sulfur spring, watched over by Chahuia women, scrubbing clothes on the rocks, and stretched out to dry himself in the sun. On his run back to the cabin each afternoon, he shot a rabbit for supper. Each evening, he climbed atop the cabin and lay back, reading Zane Grey novels. When the sun sank and the words faded, he gazed over the landscape, moved by its beauty, watching it slip from gray to purple before darkness blended land and sky. In the morning, he rose to run again. He didn't run from something or to something, not for anyone or in spite of anyone. He ran because it was what his body wished to do. The restiveness, the self-consciousness, and the need to oppose disappeared. All he felt was peace. Do you have a hobby that you love that you're able to just let the whole world disappear when you're in the middle of that? That's what running did for Louis. The next one is page 53. So I didn't want to read a lot of parts from the war. This book was really hard to read. This is the kind of book that it's so important to read to learn from past so we don't make the same mistakes again. But reading about the war and the prison camps hurt my heart. I could only read for so long at a time because it was just so hard to read. So I'm not going to read past as many passages from that, but know that he went through a lot. It was very difficult, everything that he went through. But one of the things I did want to read is the equipment that was used. So this is on page 53. Louis was trained in the use of 2 bomb sights. At that time, the military was experimenting with dive bombing tactics for heavy bombers. For dive bombing training, he had a $1 handheld sight consisting of an aluminum plate with a peg and a dangling weight. For flat runs, he had the Norden bomb sight, an extremely sophisticated analog computer that at $8,000 cost more than twice the price of the average American home. On a bombing run with the Norden sight, Louis would visually locate the target, make calculations, and feed information on airspeed, altitude, wind, and other factors into the device. The bomb sight would then take over flying the plane, follow a precise path to the target, calculate the drop angle, and release the bombs at the optimal moment. Once the bombs were gone, Louis would yell, "Bombs away!" and the pilot would take control again. Norden bomb sites were so secret that they were stored in guarded vaults and moved under armed escort, and the men were forbidden to photograph or write about them. If his plane was going down, Louis was under orders to fire his Colt 45 into the bomb site to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, then see about saving himself. The next one talks about how well his team worked together. Training was a crucible, and it transformed Phil's crew. They would not all live through what lay ahead. Phil was the pilot, and he and Louis are the two men who survived 47 days on the water in a raft. They would not all live through what lay ahead, but the survivors would speak of their good fortune in serving among such skilled men. They worked together with seamless efficiency, and judging by their training scores in the grim business of bombs and bullets, there was no better crew in the squadron. Among surviving crewmen and men from other crews, the warmest praise would be reserved for Phil. B-24s were built for tall pilots, and though Phil needed a cushion to get his feet to the pedals and his eyes over the control panel, by all accounts, he was superb at his job. Phil, Louis told a reporter, was a damn swell pilot. Throughout reading this book, I found that there were so many miracles that kept Louis alive, and the team that he worked with and the men that he formed friendships is really part of how he was able to survive. Phil was an amazing man as well. Okay, on page 127. So this is after they have crashed. The plane crashed, and only 3 men survived the crash to be able to be on rafts. And of those 3, only 2 men survived to be taken by the Japanese. So this is describing what they had with them on the raft. Pockets in the rafts contained some survival provisions. Whatever was in them was all they'd have. Louis untied the pocket flaps and looked inside. He found several thick chocolate bars, probably Hershey's military-issue Ration D bars, divided into segments and packaged in a wax-dipped container to resist gas attack. Designed to be unpalatably bitter, so soldiers would eat them only in dire circumstances, they were formulated to be highly caloric and melt-resistant. Sounds delicious. The package instructions said that each man was to be given 2 segments a day, one in the morning, one in the evening, to be held on the tongue and allowed to dissolve over 30 minutes. With the chocolate, Louis found several half-pint tins of water, a brass mirror, a flare gun, sea dye, a set of fish hooks, a spool of fishing line, and 2 air pumps in canvas cases. There was also a set of pliers with a screwdriver built into the handle. Louis pondered it for a long while, trying to come up with a reason why someone would need a screwdriver or pliers on a raft. Each raft also had a patch kit to be used if the raft leaked. That was all there was. Can you imagine surviving on that? When I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, that is dire circumstances. He literally has nothing. But that goes to show just how much you can do to survive with as little as he had. Okay. The whole time that Louis was missing, his family was absolutely certain, especially his mom. Her motherly instinct said, my son is alive, and they all felt like he was alive. And this talks about that. Sylvia, who, like the rest of the family, assumed that Louis had gone down in the ocean, told her mother not to worry. With all those islands, Sylvia said, he's teaching someone hula. Pete arrived from San Diego. If he has a toothbrush and a pocket knife and he hits land, he told his mother, he'll make it. Perhaps that day, or perhaps later, Louise found the tiny snapshot that had been taken on the afternoon Louis had left. When he had stood beside her on the front steps, his arms around her waist, on the back of the photograph, Louise wrote, Louis reported missing, May 27th, 1943. The news of Louis' disappearance headlined California newspapers and led radio broadcasts on June 5th. The Los Angeles Evening Herald and Express ran a feature on the life of Zamp, which looked an awful lot like an obituary. Peyton Jordan, now a Navy officer that was one of their childhood friends, was driving to his base When he heard the news on the radio, Jordan gasped. He drove into the base feeling numb, and for a while did nothing at all. Then he started speaking to his fellow officers. Jordan's job was to train cadets in survival techniques, and he and the others considered the possibilities that might face Louis. All of the officers agreed that if Louis had the right training, he might survive. Pete called Jordan, and they talked about Louis. As Pete spoke of his hope that Louis would be found, Jordan could hear his voice wavering. Jordan thought about calling Louis's parents, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had no idea what to say. That evening, he drove home and told his wife, Marge, who had known Louis well at USC. They moved through their routines in a quiet fog, then went to bed and lay awake in silence. In Torrance, Anthony Zamperini, that's his dad, remained stoic. Louise cried and prayed. From the stress, open sores broke out all over her hands. Sylvia thought her hands looked like raw hamburger. Somewhere in those jagged days, a fierce conviction came over Louise. She was absolutely certain that her son was alive. I am certain that the prayers of his family are part of what kept him alive. He had so many angels looking out for him here and on the other side of the veil because so many people were cheering for him to survive. This is a portion of the book that talks about how they were able to survive with what they could eat. So it occurred to Phil that from the point of view of the birds, their still forms obscured by canvas hoods must have looked like lifeless debris. He was right. One day, 9 or 10 days into their odyssey, Louis felt something alight on his hood and saw its shadow fall before him. It was an albatross. With Louis's head hidden, the bird hadn't recognized that he was landing on a man. Slowly, Louis raised his hand toward the bird, his motion so gradual that it was little more noticeable than the turning of a minute hand on a clock. The bird rested calmly. In time, Louis's hand was beside the bird, his fingers open. All at once, Louis snapped his hand shut, clamping down on the bird's legs. The bird pecked frantically, slashing his knuckles. Louis grabbed its head and broke its neck. Louis used the pliers to tear the bird open. A gust of fetid odor rose from the body, and all three men recoiled. Louis handed a bit of meat to Phil, and Mac was the third person who was on the raft with them, and took one for himself. The stench hung before them, spurring waves of nausea. Gagging, they couldn't get the meat into their mouths. Eventually, they gave up. Though they couldn't eat the bird, they finally had bait. Louis took out the fishing gear, tied a small hook to a line, baited it, and fed into the water. In a moment, that was another thing. There were sharks, like the whole time with them underneath the boat. So while he's trying to catch something, Louis took another look, tried another hook. In a moment, a shark cruised by, bit down on the hook, and severed the line, taking the bait, the hook, and a foot or two of line with him. Louis tried with another hook, and again a shark took it. A third try produced the same result. Finally, the sharks let a hook hang unmolested. Louis felt a tug and pulled up the line. On its end hung a slender pilot fish, about 10 inches long. As Louis pulled it apart, everyone felt apprehensive. None of them had eaten raw fish before. They each put a bit of meat into their mouths. It was flavorless. They ate it down to the bones. It was the first food to cross their lips in more than a week. Between three men, a small fish did not go far, but the protein gave them a push of energy. Louis had demonstrated that if they were persistent and resourceful, they could catch food, and both he and Phil felt inspired. Only Mac remained unchanged. So with what they had, they were able to catch fish and get bait to be able to get bigger fish. But I can't imagine living on a raft. Ugh. Okay. During the time that they were together, they obviously had lots of time to talk and discuss things. And Phil remembered an article that he had read, and this passage talks about that. As time passed, Phil began thinking about an article written by the World War I ace pilot Eddie Rickenbacker that he had read in Life magazine that winter. The previous October, a B-17 carrying Rickenbacker and a crew over the Pacific had become lost and run out of fuel. The pilot had ditched the plane, and it had floated long enough for men to get into the rafts. The men had drifted for weeks, surviving on stores in the rafts, rainwater, fish, and bird meat. One man had died, and the rest had hallucinated, babbling at invisible companions, singing bizarre songs, arguing about where to pull over the imaginary car in which they were riding. One lieutenant had been visited by a specter who had tried to lure him to the bottom of the ocean. Finally, the rafts had split up and one had reached an island. Natives had radioed to Funafuti, and the other men had been rescued. It seemed that Rickenbacker's crew had stretched the capacity for human survival as far as it would go. Rickenbacker had written that he had drifted for 21 days. He had actually drifted for 24, and Phil, Louis, and Mac believed that this was a survival record. In fact, the record for inflated raft survival appears to have been set in 1942, when 3 Navy plane crash victims survived for 34 days on the Pacific before reaching an island where they were sheltered by natives. At first, Phil gave no thought to counting days, but when time stretched on, he began paying attention to how long they'd been out there. He had no trouble counting days without confusion because they were on the raft for only part of the day they crashed. Phil and Louis counted the following day as day 1. With each new day, Phil told himself that surely they'd be picked up before reaching Rickenbacker's mark. When he considered what they'd do if they passed that mark, he had no answer. Rickenbacker's story, familiar to Louis, also was important for another reason. Exposure, dehydration, stress, and hunger had quickly driven many of Rickenbacker's party insane, a common fate for raft-bound men. Louis was more concerned about sanity than he was about sustenance. He kept thinking of a college psychology class he had taken, in which the instructor had taught them to think of the mind as a muscle that would atrophy if left idle. Louis was determined that no matter what happened to their bodies, their minds would stay under their control. Within a few days of the crash, Louis began peppering the other two with questions on every conceivable subject. Phil took up the challenge, and soon he and Louis turned the raft into a non-stop quiz show. They shared their histories from first memories onward, recounted in minute detail. Louis told of his days at USC. Phil spoke of Indiana. They recalled the best dates they'd ever had. They told and retold stories of practical jokes that they'd played on each other. That was something that was really fun to read in this story. They played a lot of pranks on each other as soldiers. They attacked each other on a regular basis. Every answer was followed by a question. Phil sang church hymns. Louis taught the other two lyrics to White Christmas, and they sang it over the ocean, a holiday song in June, heard only by the circling sharks. Every conversation meandered back to food. Louis had often boasted to Phil about his mother's cooking, and at some point, Phil asked Louis to describe how she made a meal. Louis began describing a dish, and all 3 men found it satisfying, so Louis kept going, telling them about each dish in the greatest possible detail. Soon Louise's kitchen floated there with them. Sauces simmered, spices were pinched and scattered, and butter melted on tongues. So began a thrice daily ritual on the raft, with pumpkin pie and spaghetti being their favorite subjects. The men came to know Louise's recipe so well that if Louis skipped a step or forgot an ingredient, Phil, and sometimes Mac, would quickly correct him and make him start over. When the imaginary meal was prepared, the men would devour every crumb, describing each mouthful. They conjured up the scene in such vivid detail that somehow their stomachs were fooled by it, if only briefly. Once the food was eaten and the past exhausted, they moved to the future. Louis had plans to buy the Torrance train depot and turn it into a restaurant. Phil fantasized about getting back to Indiana, maybe to teach school. He couldn't wait to see the Indy 500 again. The race had been suspended because of the war, but Phil revived it in his mind, spreading a blanket on the infield grass, heaping it with food, and watching the cars blur past. And he thought about Cece. Phil was engaged when he was at war. It hadn't occurred to him to tuck her picture in his wallet before he left the cottage, but in his mind, she never left him. For Louis and Phil, the conversations were healing, pulling them out of their suffering and setting the future before them as a concrete thing. As they imagined themselves back in the world again, they willed a happy ending onto their ordeal and made it their expectation. With these talks, they created something to live for. In all of these bull sessions, not once did they broach the subject of the crash. Louis wanted to talk about it, but something about Phil stopped him. There were times when Phil seemed lost in troubled thoughts, and Louis guessed that he was reliving the crash and perhaps holding himself responsible for the deaths of his men. Louis wanted to reassure Phil that he'd done nothing wrong, but he decided that raising the issue would deepen Phil's preoccupation, so he said nothing. I really liked that they were able to talk to each other about so many things to be able to lift each other's spirits, and showing how Phil and Louis were able to talk and continue using their brain and working it showed that they had something to look forward to. And Mac just slowly, he basically just fell apart. His body just broke down because his mind decided to give up, and that was when he wasn't able to make it anymore. Okay. This is a passage that talks about how much grit Louis had. Given the dismal record of raft-bound men, Mac's despair was reasonable. What is remarkable is that the two men who shared Mac's plight didn't share his hopelessness. Though Phil was constantly wondering how long this would go on, it had not yet occurred to him that he might die. The same was true for Louis. Though they both knew that they were in an extremely serious situation, both had the ability to warn fear away from their thoughts, focusing instead on how to survive and reassuring themselves that things would work out. It remains a mystery why these three young men, veterans of the same training and the same crash, differed so radically in their perceptions of their plight. Maybe the difference was biological. Some men may be wired for optimism, others for doubt. As a toddler, Louis had leapt from a train and watched it bear his family away, yet had remained cheerfully unconcerned about his safety, suggesting that he may have been a born optimist. Perhaps the men's histories had given them opposing convictions about their capacity to overcome adversity. Phil and Louis had survived Funafuti and performed uncommonly well over Nauru, and each trusted the other. If there was one thing left, he'd have given it to me, Phil once said of Louis. Mac had never seen combat, didn't know these officers, and was largely an unknown quantity to himself. All he knew about his ability to cope with this crisis was that on the first night, he had panicked and eaten the only food they had. The chocolate that they had found inside the raft, Louis had portioned it out so they would each have one in the morning, one in the evening, and he made rules for how they were going to spread out the portions, and Mac ate it all the very first night that they were on the raft. As time passed and starvation loomed, this act took on greater and greater importance, and it may have fed Mac's sense of futility. For Phil, there was another source of strength, one of which even Louis was unaware. According to his family, in his quiet, private way, Phil was a deeply religious man carrying a faith instilled in him by his parents. I had told Al several times before to always do his best as he knew how to do it, Phil's father once wrote. Phil's real name is Alan, so his family calls him Alan, and Al would have been his nickname. I had told Al several times before to always do his best as he knew how to do it, Phil's father once wrote, and when things get beyond his skill and ability to ask the Lord to step in and help out. Phil never spoke of his faith, but as he sang hymns over the ocean, conjuring up a protective God, perhaps rescue felt closer, despair more distant. From earliest childhood, Louis had regarded every limitation placed on him as a challenge to his wits, his resourcefulness, and his determination to rebel. The result had been a mutinous youth. As maddening as his exploits had been for his parents and his town, Louis' success in carrying them off had given him the conviction that he could think his way around any boundary. Now, as he was cast into extremity, despair, and death became the focus of his defiance. The same attributes that had made him the boy terror of Torrance were keeping him alive in the greatest struggle of his life. Though all three men faced the same hardship, their differing perceptions of it appeared to be shaping their fates. Louis and Phil's hope displaced their fear and inspired them to work toward their survival, and each success renewed their physical and emotional vigor. Mac's resignation seemed to paralyze him, and the less he participated in their efforts to survive, the more he slipped. Though he did the least as the days passed, it was he who faded the most. Louis and Phil's optimism and Mac's hopelessness were becoming self-fulfilling. It really is interesting to think about how much power our brains have and how much mental strength we have. If you want to seek out good, you'll find it. If you want to seek out bad, you'll find it. And if you have a goal in mind and something you're working towards, you can literally do anything. That's what I learned from this book, especially. If you have hope and a goal, with God, everything is possible. This is also another passage talking about how dire their circumstances were and basically how they decided to overcome things. So to well-fed men on land, the idea of cannibalism has always inspired revulsion. To many sailors who have stood on the threshold of death, lost in the agony and mind-altering effects of starvation, it has seemed a reasonable, even inescapable solution. For Louis, the idea of consuming a human being was revolting and unthinkable. To eat a human being, even if the person had died naturally, would be abhorrent for him. All three men held the same conviction: cannibalism wouldn't be considered then or ever. The 2-week mark was a different kind of turning point for Louis. He began to pray aloud. He had no idea how to speak to God, so he recited snippets of prayers that he'd heard in movies. Phil bowed his head as Louis spoke, offering amen at the end. Mac only listened. The raft slid on the current, their tethers snaking behind him. It seemed that they were still drifting west, but without any points of reference, the men weren't sure. At least they were going somewhere. That thought hit me really hard when I was reading this, and I wrote a note in the book that says, without a goal, we're just floating. We're all in this journey of life, given 24 hours a day, but how we use our time shows who we are and what we want to do with our life. Do I want to be a light and bring others closer to Christ? There's some food for thought. They were all in the same circumstances. Like I read in the previous passage, they'd had the same training, they were in the same war, in the same crash, but they were thinking about this in a completely different way. And by having a goal and something to work towards, that's what saved Louis and Phil. And Mac giving in, not having that goal, is basically his undoing. Okay. This is another example of their grit and resilience. This is on page 150. A few days later, Louis saw something bizarre. The edge of the sea, flush to the horizon, was peeling upward. A vast black rim formed, rose up, and began speeding toward them with a tumbling motion. Louis shouted a warning, and the other two men wheeled around toward it. They dropped down, getting their weight as low as possible so they wouldn't be flipped over. As the wave closed in, they braced themselves. Just as the wave reached them, they realized it wasn't a wave at all. It was a giant school of dolphins, swimming with astonishing speed. The dolphins rushed at the rafts and were soon muscling all around them. Looking into the water, Phil saw small fish, thousands of them, seeming to fill the ocean. The dolphins were chasing them. The men thrust their arms into the water and tried to grab some, but the fish slipped through their fingers. If they had had a net, they could have whisked it through the water and filled the rafts. But with only their fingers, they couldn't snare even one. Louis was out of bait. Other than the sharks, the only fish that ventured near the rafts were pilotfish, which hugged the sides of the sharks as they circled. They were within easy reach, only when Louis tried to grab them, they squirted away. The sharks had stolen every hook small enough to fit in the mouths of pilotfish. So Louis tried albatross bones, but the fish spat them out. Looking at the fish line that he had left, he got an idea. He cut off small portions of the line, tied them to the large fish hooks, and then tied 3 hooks to the fingers of one hand, one on his pinky, one on his middle finger, and one on his thumb, orienting them as if they were claws. He held his hand over the water's surface and waited. A shark, attended by a pilotfish, swam by. Once its head had passed, Louis sank his hand into the water. When the unsuspecting pilotfish moved under his hand, he snapped his fingers shut around its back. The hooks dug in, and Louis yanked the fish out of the water, jubilant. He's so tricky. He came up with so many different ways to be able to feed them, and I don't know how he did it, and he kept positive. This is another excerpt about the sharks. Sharks terrify me. I don't love sharks or snakes, and I can't imagine having sharks around him the whole time. So this is something that happened with some sharks. Louis recoiled, pulling his legs toward his body. The current was too strong for him to get his legs beneath him, but he was able to swing them to the side, away from the shark's mouth. The shark kept coming directly at Louis's head. Louis remembered the advice of the old man in Honolulu: make a threatening expression, then stiff-arm the shark's snout. While the men were stationed in Hawaii, Louis had taken several classes for self-defense and how to survive basically in Hawaii. So he learned how to deal with sharks. As the shark lunged for his head, Louis bared his teeth, widened his eyes, and rammed his palm into the tip of the shark's nose. The shark flinched, circled away, then swam back for a second pass. Louis waited again, Louis waited until the shark was inches from him, then struck it in the nose again. Again, the shark peeled away. Above, the bullets had stopped coming. I forgot to say what happened. So this particular instance, a Japanese plane had found them and were firing at them. And they would jump out of the raft where the sharks were and then come back into the raft when the plane passed. So above, the bullets had stopped coming. As quickly as he could, Louis pulled himself along the cord until he reached the raft. He grabbed its wall and lifted himself clear of the shark. Mac and Phil were lying together in the fetal position. They were absolutely still, and bullet holes dappled the raft around them. Louis shook Mac. Mac made a sound. Louis asked if he'd been hit. Mac said no. Louis spoke to Phil. Phil said he was okay. The bomber circled back for another go. Phil and Mac played dead, and Louis tipped back into the ocean. As bullets knifed the water around him, the shark came at him, and again Louis bumped its snout and repelled it. Then a second shark charged at him. Louis hung there, gyrating in the water and flailing his arms and legs as the shark snapped at him and the bullets came down. The moment the bomber sped out of firing range, he clambered onto the raft again. Phil and Mac were still unhit. 4 more times, the Japanese strafed them, sending Louis into the water to kick and punch the sharks until the bomber had passed. Though he fought them to the point of exhaustion, he was not bitten. Every time he emerged from the water, he was certain that Phil and Mac would be dead. Impossibly, though, there were bullet holes all the way around the men, even the tiny spaces between them. Not one bullet had hit either of the men. The bomber crew made a last gesture of sadism. The plane circled back and Louis ducked into the water yet again. The plane's bomb bay doors rolled open and a depth charge tumbled out, splashing down some 50 feet from the rafts. The men braced themselves for an explosion, but none came. Either the charge was a dud or the bombardier had forgotten to arm it. If the Japanese are this inept, Phil thought, America will win this war. Louis rolled back onto the raft and collapsed. When the bomber came back, he was too tired to go overboard. As the plane passed a final time, Louis, Mac, and Phil lay still. The gunners didn't fire. The bomber flew west and disappeared. When I read that passage, I was just, oh my gosh. Everything happens to this poor guy. How the heck did he survive? All of the things he survived. But as he recounts later in the book, he realized that they were each miracles that were saving him. Okay, this next portion is talking about how he had an intellectual refuge while he was on the raft. Louis found that the raft offered an unlikely intellectual refuge. He had never recognized how noisy the civilized world was. Here, drifting in almost total silence with no sense other than the singed odor of the raft, the color of the dye was rubbing off on all the men, so they were turning yellow from the sun, and it was starting to smell, the rubber. No flavors on his tongue, nothing moving but the slow procession of shark fins. Every vista empty save water and sky, his time unvaried and unbroken. His mind was freed of an encumbrance that civilization had imposed on it. In his head he could roam anywhere, and he found that his mind was quick and clear, his imagination unfettered and supple. He could stay with a thought for hours, turning it about. He had always enjoyed excellent recall, but on the raft, his memory became infinitely more nimble, reaching back further, offering detail that had once escaped him. One day, trying to pinpoint his earliest memory, he saw a 2-story building and inside a stairway broken into 2 parts of 6 steps each, with a landing in between. He was there in the image, a tiny child toddling along the stairs. As he crawled down the first set of steps and moved toward the edge of the landing, a tall yellow dog stepped in front of him to stop him from tumbling off. It was his parents' dogs, Askin, whom they had had in Olean when Louis was very little. Louis had never remembered him before. On the 40th day, Louis was lying beside Phil under the canopy when he abruptly sat up. He could hear singing. He kept listening. It sounded like a choir. He nudged Phil and asked him if he heard anything. Phil said no. Louis slid the canopy off and squinted into the daylight. The ocean was a featureless flatness. He looked up. Above him, floating in a bright cloud, he saw human figures silhouetted against the sky. He counted 21 of them. They were singing the sweetest song he had ever heard. Louis stared up, astonished, listening to the singing. What he was seeing and hearing was impossible, and yet he felt absolutely lucid. This was, he felt certain, no hallucination, no vision. He sat under the singers, listening to their voices, memorizing the melody until they faded away. Phil had heard and seen nothing. Whatever this had been, Louis concluded it belonged to him alone. Louis had angels, for sure, who were helping him, and when he recognized that was just for him, it was a hug from Heavenly Father. Okay, the next portion, I thought it would be interesting to share some of the statistics of the war. This is on page 314. In its rampage over the East, Japan had brought atrocity and death on a scale that staggers the imagination. In the midst of it were the prisoners of war. Japan held some 132,000 POWs from America, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Holland, and Australia. Of those, nearly 36,000 died, more than 1 in 4. Americans fared particularly badly. Of the 34,648 Americans held by Japan, 12,935, more than 37%, died. By comparison, only 1% of Americans held by the Nazis and Italians died. Japan murdered thousands of POWs on death marches and worked thousands of others to death in slavery, including some 16,000 POWs who died alongside as many as 100,000 Asian laborers forced to build the Burma-Siam Railway. Thousands of other POWs were beaten, burned, stabbed, or clubbed to death, shot, beheaded, killed during medical experiments, or eaten alive in ritual acts of cannibalism. And as a result of being fed grossly inadequate and befouled food and water, thousands more died of starvation and easily preventable diseases. Of the 2,500 POWs at Borneo's Sandakan camp, only 6, all escapees, made it to September 1945 alive. Left out of the numbing statistics are untold numbers of men who were captured and killed on the spot or dragged to places like Kwajalein to be murdered without the world ever knowing their fate. In accordance with the kill-all order, the Japanese massacred all 5,000 Korean captives on Tinian, all of the POWs on Balali, Waki, and Tarawa, and all but 11 POWs at Palawan. They were evidently about to murder all the other POWs and civilian internees in their custody when the atomic bomb brought their empire crashing down. On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, Japan signed its formal surrender. The Second World War was over. Reading the statistics and seeing, I don't even know how to describe it, but just seeing the bad things that happen from war because of power and money, and I don't understand war. I don't understand wanting to have power over another people and making so many other people do your dirty work. Basically, the Japanese people were starving and falling apart. When I was telling my kids about this book, I compared it to the Civil War with the South, like not being able to have food, and they didn't have supplies, and they basically were starving because they couldn't get anything. And war affected everybody. Everyone was hurt, and to see those numbers, it was just really hard to read. Okay. This is describing, so the soldiers had been saved, the war is over, they're going home, and this is Donald Knox. Nope. I'll just read it. A few of the trains slipped past Hiroshima. Virtually every POW believed that the destruction of the city had saved them from execution. John Faulkner, a survivor of the Bataan Death March, looked out at Hiroshima as Hiroshima neared. First, there were trees, he told historian Donald Knox. Then the leaves were missing. As you got closer, branches were missing. Closer still, the trunks were gone. And then, as you got in the middle, there's nothing. Nothing. It was beautiful. I realized this was what had ended the war. It meant we didn't have to go hungry any longer or go without medical treatment. I was so insensitive to anyone else's human needs and suffering. I know it's not right to say it was beautiful, because it really wasn't, but I believe the end probably justified the means. that was a thought I wanted to bring up. What do you think are circumstances that justify the means? It's something to think about. He later said, it couldn't have been beautiful. That everything was completely destroyed, but that also meant the war was over and we wouldn't have to suffer anymore. This is when Louis gets to see his family. So he sees Pete first. Each felt startled by the sight of the other. Oh, and Louis, he asked, like, he had a date to go home, and he asked if it could be extended so that he could gain weight and be able to be a little bit more healthy before he saw his mom. So he was able to get a lot more healthy before he actually came home. So Pete had expected Louis to be emaciated and was surprised to find him looking rather portly. Louis was disturbed to see how the years of worry had depleted his brother. Pete was gaunt, and he'd gone largely bald. The brothers fell together, eyes shining. Pete and Louis spent several days together in San Francisco, while doctors finally cured Louis of his dysentery. After reading the Trumbull article, there was a quote in the article that Louis had said if he had known what was going to happen to him, he would have killed himself. So this is in reference to that article. After reading the Trumbull article, Pete had worried that Louis might be severely traumatized, but as the two laughed and kidded each other, his fears faded. Louis was as upbeat and garrulous as ever. Once, when a group of reporters shuffled in to interview Louis, they crowded around Pete, assuming that of the two men, this haggard one had to be the POW. On a drizzling October day, the Army sent a banged-up B-25 to San Francisco to bring Louis home. Pete, still AWOL, went aboard with his brother. The plane lifted off and rose over the clouds into a shining blue morning. Scared to death of flying, Pete tried to distract himself from the plane's rattles and groans by staring out over a carpet of bright clouds, the upside of the rainstorm. He felt as if he could step from the plane and walk on them. Over Long Beach, they sank back into the rain and landed. There, bursting from Army cars, were their mother and father and Sylvia and Virginia. The moment the plane stopped, Louis jumped down, ran to his sobbing mother, and folded himself around her. "Cada mamma mia," he whispered. It was a long time before they let go. The night before I got to the point where he was rescued, I read until like 1 o'clock in the morning. I told my husband, I can't read all this hard stuff anymore. I got to get through this to be able to read when he's rescued, and to read that he was finally with his family was just a joy to see that he was able to finally make it home. So after Louis got home, he had a really, really hard time. So many emotional and mental and PTSD, and the Japanese camp leader, his nickname was the Bird, just destroyed Louis, and he had nightmares about him literally every night. He was just terrified of him. And he was in a really, really, really bad place when his wife, Cynthia, just begged him, you have to come to this preacher's sermon. You have to come and see. It was Billy Graham. And this is when Louis was finally saved. Under the tent that night, Graham spoke of how the world was in an age of war, an age defined by persecution and suffering. Why, Graham asked, is God silent while good men suffer? He began his answer by asking his audience to consider the evening sky. If you look into the heavens tonight, on this beautiful California night, I see the stars and can see the footprints of God, he said. I think to myself, my Father, my Heavenly Father, hung them there with a flaming fingertip and holds them there with the power of his omnipotent hand. And he runs the whole universe, and he's not too busy running the whole universe to count the hairs on my head and see a sparrow when it falls, because God is interested in me. God spoke in creation. Louis was winding tight. He remembered the day when he and Phil, slowly dying on the raft, had slid into the doldrums. Above the sky had been a swirl of light. Below, the stilled ocean had mirrored the sky, its clarity broken only by a leaping fish. Awed to silence, forgetting his thirst and his hunger, forgetting that he was dying, Louis had known only gratitude. That day he had believed that what lay around them was the work of infinitely broad, benevolent hands, a gift of compassion. In the years since, that thought had been lost. Graham went on. He spoke of God reaching into the world through miracles and the intangible blessings that give men the strength to outlast their sorrows. God works miracles one after another, he said. God says, if you suffer, I'll give you the grace to go forward. Louis found himself thinking of the moment at which he had woken in the sinking hull of Green Hornet, the wires that had trapped him a moment earlier, now inexplicably gone. And he remembered the Japanese bombers swooping over the rafts, riddling them with bullets, and yet not a single bullet had struck him, Phil, or Mac. He had fallen into unbearably cruel worlds, and yet he had borne them. When he turned these memories in his mind, the only explanation he could find was one in which the impossible was possible. What God asks of men, said Graham, is faith. His invisibility is the truest test of that faith. To know who sees him, God makes himself seen. Louis shone with sweat. He felt accused, cornered, pressed by a frantic urge to flee. As Graham asked for heads to bow and eyes to close, Louis stood abruptly and rushed for the street, towing Cynthia behind him. Nobody leaving, said Graham. You can leave while I'm preaching, but not now. Everybody is still and quiet, every head bowed, every eye closed. He asked the faithful to come forward. Louis pushed past the congregants in his row, charging for the exit. His mind was tumbling. He felt enraged, violent, on the edge of explosion. He wanted to hit someone. As he reached the aisle, he stopped. Cynthia, the rows of bowed heads, the sawdust underfoot, the tent around him, all disappeared. A memory long beaten back, the memory from which he had run the evening before, was upon him. Louis was on the raft. There was gentle Phil, crumpled up before him, Mac's breathing skeleton, endless ocean stretching away in every direction, the sun lying over him, the cunning body on the sharks waiting, circling. He was a body on a raft, dying of thirst. He felt words whisper with his swollen lips. It was a promise thrown at heaven, a promise he had not kept, a promise he had allowed himself to forget until just this instant. If you will save me, I will serve you forever. And then, standing under a circus tent on a clear night in downtown Los Angeles, Louis felt rain falling. It was the last flashback he would ever have. Louis let go of Cynthia and turned toward Graham. He felt supremely alive. He began walking. This is it, said Graham. God has spoken to you. You come on. Cynthia kept her eyes on Louis all the way home. When they entered the apartment, Louis went straight to his cache of liquor. It was the time of night when the need usually took hold of him, but for the first time in years, Louis had no desire to drink. He carried the bottles to the kitchen sink, opened them, and poured their contents into the drain. Then he hurried through the apartment, gathering packs of cigarettes, a secret stash of girly magazines, everything that was part of his ruined years. He heaved it all down the trash chute. In the morning, he woke feeling cleansed. For the first time in 5 years, the bird hadn't come into his dreams. The bird would never come again. Louis dug out the Bible that had been issued to him by the Air Corps and mailed home to his mother when he was believed dead. He walked to Barnsdall Park, where he and Cynthia had gone on better days and where Cynthia had gone alone when he'd been on his benders. He found a spot under a tree, sat down, and began reading. Resting in the shade and the stillness, Louis felt profound peace. When he thought of his history, that what resonated with him now was not all that he had suffered, but the divine love that he believed had intervened to save him. He was not the worthless, broken, forsaken man that the bird had striven to make him. In a single silent moment, his rage, his fear, his humiliation, and helplessness had fallen away. That morning, he believed, was a new creation. Softly, he wept. It was love and the testimony of another that brought him out of his darkness. And then he was able to heal, and he did a lot of good. This is a passage when he went back to Japan and saw the guards that were in the prison camps. On page 378, the former guards, 850 of them, sat cross-legged on the floor of a large, bare, common room. Standing at the front of the room, Louis looked out over the faces. At first, he recognized none of them. Then, far in the rear, he saw a face he knew, then another and another. Curly, the Weasel, Kono, Jimmy Sasaki, and there was the Quack, who was petitioning to have his death penalty commuted. All of the camp leaders had nicknames that the soldiers called them. As Louis looked at this last man, he thought of Bill Harris. There was one face missing. Louis couldn't find the bird. When he asked his escort where Watanabe was, he was told that he wasn't in Sugamo. Over 5 years, thousands of policemen had scoured Japan in search of him, but they never found him. As Louis had been packing to come to Japan, the long-awaited day had arrived in the life of Shizuka Watanabe. That is the bird's mom. October 1st, 1950, the day her son had promised to come to her. If he was still alive, he had told her to go to the Shinjuku district in Tokyo, where he would meet her at the same restaurant where they had last seen each other 2 years before. At 10:05 that morning, police saw Shizuka climb aboard a train bound for the Shinjuku district. At the restaurant, Mutsuhiro apparently never showed up. Shizuka, my son is much better at Japanese. I need to work on my Japanese. Shizuka went to Kofu and checked into a hotel, staying alone, taking no visitors. For 4 days, she wandered the city. Then she left Kofu abruptly without paying her a hotel bill. The police went in to question her, the hotel matron. Asked if Shizuka had spoken of her son, the matron said yes. Mutsuhiro, Shizuka had said, has already died. In the corner of a sitting room in her house, Shizuka would keep a small shrine to Mutsuhiro, a tradition among bereaved Japanese families. Each morning, she would leave an offering in memory of her son. In Sugamo, Louis asked his escort what had happened to the bird. He was told that it was believed that the former sergeant, hunted, exiled, and in despair, had stabbed himself to death. The words washed over Louis. In prison camp, Watanabe had forced him to live in incomprehensible degradation and violence. Bereft of his dignity, Louis had come home to a life lost in darkness and had dashed himself against the memory of the bird. But on an October night in Los Angeles, Louis had found, in Peyton Jordan's word, daybreak. That night, the sense of shame and powerlessness that had driven his need to hate the bird had vanished. The bird was no longer his monster. He was only a man. In Sugamo prison, as he was told of Watanabe's fate, all Louis saw was a lost person, a life now beyond redemption. He felt something that he had never felt for his captor before. With a shiver of amazement, he realized that it was compassion. At that moment, something shifted sweetly inside him. It was forgiveness, beautiful and effortless and complete. For Louis Zamperini, the war was over. It continues to talk about more things he did with his life, doing good. He created a camp for boys to help them, kind of like he had as a troubled teen. And he was able to run the torch in multiple Olympics. And this is a passage about that. His body gave no quarter to age or punishment. In time, even his injured leg healed. When Louis was in his 60s, he was still climbing Cahuenga Peak every week and running a mile in under 6 minutes. In his 70s, he discovered skateboarding. At 85, he returned to Kwajalein on a project, ultimately unsuccessful, to locate the bodies of the 9 Marines whose names had been etched in the wall of his cell. When I get old, he said as he tossed a football on the Kwajalein beach, I'll let you know. When he was 90, his neighbors looked up to see him balancing high in a tree in his yard, chainsaw in hand. When God wants me, he'll take me, he told an incredulous Pete. Why the hell are you trying to help him? Pete replied. Well into his 10th decade of life, between the occasional broken bone, he still could be seen perched on skis, merrily cannonballing down mountains. He remained infectiously and incorrigibly cheerful. He once told a friend that the last time he could remember being angry was some 40 years before. That one really hit me. I've thought about it quite a few times since. Not being angry for 40 whole years is a feat in itself. His conviction that everything happened for a reason and would come to good gave him a laughing equanimity even in hard times. In late 2008, when he was about to turn 92, he was moving a slab of concrete on a dolly down a flight of stairs when the dolly wheels broke, sending Louis and the concrete crashing down the steps. He wound up in the hospital with a minor hip fracture and a shattered thumb. As his daughter came down the hospital corridor toward his room, she heard shouts of, "Hey, Louis!" from the crowd of friends that her father had made among the hospital staff. I never knew anyone, Pete once said, who didn't love Louis. As soon as he was out of the hospital, Louis went on a 3-mile hike. Oh, he's an amazing man. This is in the epilogue, and it's talking about reconciliation on page 394. In the decades after the war, the abandoned Nautsu campsite decayed, and the village residents didn't speak of what had transpired there. Over time, the memory was largely lost, but in 1978, a former POW wrote a letter to teachers at Nautsu High School, beginning a dialogue that introduced many locals to the tragedy that had taken place in their village. 10 years later, former POW Frank Hull journeyed back to the village, which had joined another village to form Jotsu City. He planted 3 eucalyptus seedlings outside City Hall and gave city leaders a plaque in memory of the 60 Australians who had died in the camp. As they learned the POW's stories, Jotsu residents responded with sympathy. Residents formed a group dedicated to building a peace park to honor the dead POWs and bring reconciliation. Among the founding members was Shoichi Ishizuka, a veteran who'd been held a POW by the Americans and treated so kindly that he referred to the experience as lucky prison life. When he learned what his Allied counterparts had endured in his own village, he was horrified. A council was formed, fundraising began, and exhibits were erected in town. If the plan succeeded, Jotsu would become among the 91 cities in Japan in which POW camps once stood, the first to create a memorial to the POWs who had suffered and died there. Though 85% of Jotsu residents donated to the park fund, the plan generated heated controversy. Some residents fought the plan vehemently, calling in death threats and vowing to tear down the memorial and burn supporters' homes. In keeping with the goal of reconciliation, the Memorial Council sought the participation of relatives of the guards who'd been convicted and hanged, but the families balked, fearing ostracism. To honor the grief of families on both sides of the war, the council proposed creating a single cenotaph for both the POWs and the hanged guards, but this deeply offended the former POWs. At one point, the plan was nearly given up. Eventually, the spirit of reconciliation prevailed. In October 1995, on the site of the former Nautsu camp, the Peace Park was dedicated. The focal point was a pair of statues of angels flying above a cenotaph in which rested Hull's plaque. In a separate cenotaph a few yards away was a plaque in memory of the 8 hanged guards. At the guards' families' request, no names were inscribed on it, only a simple phrase, 8 stars in the peaceful sky. That's something that really hit me too, is reading both sides of the story. Families were hurt on both sides. And the absolutely terrible things that the guards did, they had family too. And family was also sad that they had passed away. This is how he tried to talk to the bird on page 396. One day, 9 months later, as he prepared to return to Japan to carry the Olympic torch, Louis sat at his desk for hours thinking. Then he clicked on his computer and began to write. To Matsuhiro Watanabe, as a result of my prisoner of war experience under your unwarranted and unreasonable punishment, my post-war life became a nightmare. It was not so much due to the pain and suffering as it was the tension of stress and humiliation that caused me to hate with a vengeance. Under your discipline, my rights, not only as a prisoner of war, but also as a human being, were stripped from me. It was a struggle to maintain enough dignity and hope to live until the war's end. The post-war nightmares caused my life to crumble, but thanks to a confrontation with God, through the evangelist Billy Graham, I committed my life to Christ. Love replaced the hate I had for you, Christ said. Forgive your enemies and pray for them. As you probably know, I returned to Japan in 1952 and was graciously allowed to address all the Japanese war criminals at Sugamo prison. I asked then about you and was told that you probably had committed harakiri, which I was sad to hear. At that moment, like the others, I also forgave you and now would hope that you would also become a Christian. Louis Zamperini. He folded the letter and carried it with him to Japan. The meeting was not to be. CBS contacted Watanabe and told him that Zamperini wanted to come see him. Watanabe practically spat his reply. The answer was no. When Louis arrived in Jotsu, he still had his letter. Someone took it from him, promising to get it to Watanabe. If Watanabe received it, he never replied. Watanabe died in April of 2003. The very last paragraph of this book is such a good description of the life of Louis Zamperini. This is when he was holding the torch for the Olympics. Louis ran through the place where cages had once held him, where a black-eyed man had crawled inside him, but the cages were long gone, and so was the bird. There was no trace of them here among the voices, the falling snow, and the old and joyful man running. I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. This book completely changed my life. It is one of those that, as you read it and think about it, you're able to see your trials are so small compared to those of so many people. And if you have a goal in mind and an eternal perspective, and you're able to see Heavenly Father's hand throughout your life, the blessings, like Louis, when he was reminiscing, he realized the bullets came, none of them were shot. He saw the angels singing. He was able to make it through so many hard things. And those were all moments when Heavenly Father had his hand in his life. And if we have that eternal perspective and realize that we already know who wins, you just have to pick the Savior's side, we can literally get through anything. And in also thinking that, that means that we can show love and help those around us to also seek out the miracles in their own lives and to be able to keep that eternal perspective. And I really hope that you enjoyed this discussion, learning about Louis Zamperini, and it gives you a moment to pause and think about what you're grateful for and to see God throughout your life too. Happy reading.